Today's topic is the study to explore early development, SEED, and overview. And we were really delighted to bring this to you. With respect to SEED, which is funded by the Centers for Disease Control, we're entering our third decade of work. We never dreamed in 2001 when Lisa Miller at the Health Department invited us to join in this application for work on autism surveillance and a case control study, that we'd be still working in this area 2 decades later, but we're thrilled that that has been the case. Carolyn DiGiuseppe, who will go first, will give a lot more detail about that history with SEED. But again, we're really delighted to have been able to do this work looking at autism, starting in days when the frequency, while growing, was thought to be much less than it is today. Please feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box at any time, and please be sure to keep your microphone muted so that we do not hear background noise. As you saw on the screen, we are recording today's event and will archive it on the JFK Partners website along with the other webinars in this series. We have already posted the handout for today, which you are welcome to print or save for future reference. Following the webinar, you will receive a link requesting an evaluation. You may request a certificate of attendance in the evaluation. So we have 4 presenters, all SEED investigators this morning, talking about different areas of findings in the work that's been done by SEED. The presenters in order are Dr. Carolyn DiGiuseppe, Dr. Tessa Kroom, Dr. Ann Reynolds, and Dr. Nuri Reyes. I'll give you a brief kind of synopsis of all 4 of these wonderful presenters, and then as each finishes their presentation, they will hand it off to the next presenter. Dr. DiGiuseppe is currently principal investigator on the CDC funded follow-up work that we're doing with the first and second cohorts within the SEED study. She is one of the original investigators on Colorado SEED, joining the project at the proposal stage as the project epidemiologist. Dr. Giuseppe does a lot of other things in addition to her work with SEED, and she directs the preventive medicine residency program and previously served as the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at the Colorado School for Public Health. She also serves as Director of Evidence-Based Medicine in the School of Medicine. She joined the faculty of the University of Colorado in 2000, and before that was Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Child Health, University College London. She did amazing work as Associate Dean within the School of Public Health, particularly advocating for junior faculty and supporting career development. She served previously as a senior health policy analyst at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and as a project director and senior advisor for the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force Guide to Clinical Preventive Services in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Disease and Prevention and Health Promotion. Dr. Giuseppe coming in 2000, the timing couldn't have been better. That's just when this opportunity came up with the CDC, and it's been wonderful to work with her these past 2 decades. In addition to work on autism, she's been principal investigator on training grants from American Cancer Society and HRSA to enhance the education of preventive medicine residents at CU Anschutz Medical Campus. And she has had a career-long interest in injury prevention, an area of expertise which she's been able to combine with the work on Project SEED. Dr. Tessa Kroom is an associate professor in the epidemiology department at the Colorado School of Health at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Her research focuses on the development and utilization of public health surveillance systems to understand the burden of disease. She has been an academic researcher since 2011, before which she worked for a decade as an applied epidemiologist at the state and federal level, analyzing surveillance data and evaluating public health impact. She has taught the core epidemiology class at the Colorado School of Public Health for 9 years and has been engaged with us on SEED for a number of years, bringing wonderful expertise in epidemiology. Ann Reynolds, Dr. Reynolds is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and the medical director of developmental pediatrics at Children's Hospital, Colorado. She received her undergraduate degree from Emory University and her medical degree from the Medical College of Georgia. Dr. Reynolds completed her residency training in pediatrics at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and her fellowship in neurodevelopmental disabilities at Baylor College of Medicine. She joined the faculty at University of Colorado, not sure whether it was 1999 or 2000, but again, very opportune timing given her interest. She has been a SEED investigator from the very beginning. She has a research interest in co-occurring medical conditions in children with autism spectrum disorders, including sleep, intestinal, and nutritional issues. Dr. Nuri Reyes is a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus and Children's Hospital, Colorado. Prior to going to the University of Colorado for her internship and fellowship, Dr. Reyes completed her PhD in clinical psychology at Virginia Tech and her BA in psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Reyes' concentration is in early child development, autism, and related neurodevelopmental disorders. Currently, she provides diagnostic assessments in English and Spanish speaking children at increased prevalence for autism spectrum disorder and developmental delays. Her previous research experience has included studies with youth with developmental delays, intellectual disabilities, and typical development. She has worked in SEED as a clinician since 2013 and has for the past several years and currently is serving as the lead psychology clinician. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Dr. Giuseppe.
Thank you for that comprehensive and warm introduction for all of us. I'm going to share my screen and hope that this will be successful. There we go. All right, so first, can everybody see that? Some nods, yes?
Yes.
Great. Okay, all right, perfect. So thank you all very much for coming today. I'm starting off this session by telling you a little bit about the SEED follow-up study that we just launched last summer. And to start with, for those of you who aren't familiar with the SEED study itself, I wanted to just talk briefly about SEED, the study to explore early development. So as Dr. Rosenberg pointed out, this study was started more than 2 decades ago. And the original aims were to be able to describe and understand how behavior varied among young children with autism spectrum disorder, which I'll refer to as ASD going forward, to describe some of the developmental, medical, and behavioral conditions that are commonly seen in these children, such as seizure disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and other conditions. And then to gain a better understanding about the genetic and environmental factors. And by environmental, we mean everything from infectious to obstetric to occupational and immunological factors that might contribute to the development of ASD and to how it manifests. So in order to accomplish this, we developed and launched a large national study in which we enrolled children aged 2 to 5, that is the preschool age, who had autism spectrum disorder or ASD based on standardized instruments. And we compared them to children with other developmental delays and disorders and disabilities that were not ASD related, and then to children in the same age group who were sampled from the general population. And that study was implemented across 8 states in the US over multiple phases, with the first phase launching enrollment in 2006, and the third phase, the last one, ending enrollment last year. Throughout these 3 phases, we have collected comprehensive information from about the child and the mother and father. And we have administered standardized functional assessments, and we've also collected biological specimens. To date, we have already published more than 60 peer-reviewed papers in leading scientific journals, and we actually have more than 80 ongoing analyses for additional papers. So there's a lot of activity with the data that have been collected over the last 15 years. This graph just is to demonstrate that these papers span across all those domains that I mentioned in terms of the study aims, both describing these children, their characteristics and traits, what are some of the environmental and genetic factors that might contribute to their conditions, and so forth. So SEED3 ended in June 2021, and we have a huge amount of data on more than 6,000 families, including more than 2,000 children with ASD. Those children who were enrolled in each of those phases when they were ages 2 to 5 years old are now aged 5 to 19 years. And so we thought it would be important to see if we could better understand the life course experiences of children with ASD and other developmental disorders as they age by going back and recontacting and collecting data on all of those participants that we had previously enrolled. So that's basically the SEED follow-up studies, which consist of multiple different components. And I'm going to just talk about a few of those. Part 1 is the follow-up surveys of existing SEED participants, in which we're trying to understand better how adolescents and young adults with ASD differ from those with other developmental disorders or from the general population, as well as how their characteristics as adolescents and young adults relate to what they looked like when they were 2 to 5 years of age. And to do this, we're going to administer surveys to the caregivers, parents or other caregivers of all those existing SEED participants. We are administering multiple different surveys. All of them, all those who agree to participate in the follow-up surveys will get a core survey in which we ask a range of questions of the caregivers. We also have some age-specific surveys that have different content depending on the current age of the child. That is, were they enrolled in SEED1 or SEED2 or SEED3. And then for a subset of those families who were enrolled in Seed 1, if they participate in that core survey, we would like to go back again once the child participant becomes an adult and survey the participant themselves. The core survey I mentioned is covering a wide range of topics, and these are some of them. We mentioned that we were interested in looking at what happens in terms of their co-occurring in symptoms and conditions. We are interested in asking about what kinds of service use and need and supports that they need and that they're getting. Some important issues around bullying, discrimination, and safety, as well as the child's current level of independence and adaptive behavior, and then what are the impacts on the family as the child has aged from the preschool age. This just briefly summarizes those age-specific surveys I mentioned. For the young children, we'll administer additional functional assessments in terms of sensory and executive function. For early middle school, or excuse me, for early high school age 10 to 14, we're interested in what do these children look like now, 10 years beyond when we initially evaluated them. And also, what are the parents expecting of these children in terms of education and employment, and what kind of planning are they doing for transitioning from high school, transitioning their healthcare, and so forth. And then for those who are older adolescents, we want to ask the family about what's happening for the child in terms of vocational training, employment, and education. I mentioned that a second follow-up survey that would be administered to those children who are now age 18 or older and have exited high school. And we have a brief survey of the caregiver, but the emphasis is on surveying the adult with ASD themselves, asking about a range of characteristics, including mental health issues, quality of life, sexuality, employment, and so forth. So just to summarize part 1, these are these follow-up surveys of all the participants in Seed 1, 2, and 3, where we're trying to get at a wide range of issues around what's happening with them now that they are 5 to 15 years out from the original enrollment and data collection, and how where they are now relates to where they were when they were 2 to 5 years of age. So that's part 1. Part 2 is in-person assessment of intellectual abilities of SEED participants. Part 2 we were interested in doing because we wanted to understand how intellectual functioning currently relates to other outcomes among persons with ASD, as well as other developmental disabilities, how their intellectual functioning relates to their daily activities, how those abilities have changed as they've aged from preschool to adolescence, and what factors are influencing those changes that have occurred. So in order to do this, we are inviting families whose caregiver completed that first follow-up survey to come into the clinic and have the child receive 2 standardized instruments, the Stanford Binet, in order to assess their cognitive abilities, as well as a test of processing speed to assess how well they can make sense of new information compared to other people of the same age. So that's part 2, briefly. Part 3 is maximizing the impact of existing SEED data. So along with collecting new information, we also want to continue to be able to take advantage of the extensive data we have, as I said, on more than 6,000 families on a wide range of domains and topics, some of which you'll hear a little bit about right after this, my presentation. And so with the existing data, we want to continue to analyze those data to understand characteristics and needs of children with ASD. We want to use those data to identify subgroups susceptible to various contributing factors. And we want to share those findings with scientific, professional, and public audiences, whether through presentations like this one, through peer-reviewed papers, through scientific presentations, and so forth. So, oops, I'm sorry, I accidentally changed that. So we're doing this longitudinal follow-up in hopes that we can inform strategies for better understanding the needs of children and families as they age, children and families affected by ASD as those children age from preschool to early adolescence, to older adolescence, and then to young adulthood, in order to hopefully improve that quality of life. And also by better understanding their health and functioning as they mature, potentially reduce any adverse public health and economic impacts of ASD that might occur. I want to acknowledge our team. We have a lot of folks who are contributing, some of whom are here on this call today, to the SEED follow-up studies. Thank you. Are there questions? I think I have to stop share to see the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions. So I think with that, I will pass this on to the next presenter, Dr. Tessa Kroom.
Okay, thank you. Share my screen here. Okay, is that, am I sharing the correct thing?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about an analysis that I've been working on in SEED, looking at the relationship between parental depression and anxiety and dysregulation among children in the SEED study. So we're looking at them in the preschool period, and we sought to investigate this relationship among the children with ASD as well as the children without ASD in the study. So a little background on this topic. Our current knowledge on the causes or the etiology of ASD are evolving as additional research is completed. Similarly, we're really learning in the SEED study and other studies about the different expressions of ASD in early childhood, the different conditions and behaviors that really contribute to this diverse presentation of the condition. Previous research has found that maternal anxiety and depression has been associated with an expression of ASD that is characterized by mild language and motor delays, as well as dysregulation in preschool-age children. And dysregulation is defined as a lower ability to manage emotional responses, including sadness, anger, frustration, and irritability. Dysregulation can include behavioral and emotional problems, as well as issues with sleep. And so we felt that it was important to understand the relationship between mental health conditions in the parents and different presentations of ASD in preschool-age children. We embarked upon this study with the goal of increasing our understanding and strengthening our ability to recognize different presentations of ASD, and to also understand some of the underlying factors that may contribute to the risk of this condition. The goal of the research was to identify specific associations between parental anxiety and depression and the presence of dysregulation associated behaviors among children with ASD and SEED, And as I've mentioned, we also explored this relationship in SEED among the parent-child pairs where the child did not have ASD. So that was really interesting to be able to explore the differences in some of the relationships that we detected. We will evaluate the relationship between both the presence of maternal anxiety and depression and paternal anxiety and depression. And further, if we do detect there's a relationship between parental anxiety and depression, we will further explore more specific aspects of dysregulation, including behavioral characteristics that are associated with externalizing dysregulation, internalizing dysregulation, and sleep issues. So the specific aspects of dysregulation that were measured in the SEED study were assessed using a questionnaire called the Child Behavior Checklist for Preschool Children. It was completed by interviewing caregivers, largely mothers, and then an analysis of the answers provided was used to create different indicators of the extent to which children had evidence of dysregulation related to externalizing issues, internalizing issues, and then sleep-related problems. So externalizing issues is broadly defined as actions that direct problematic energy towards others. It's characterized by impulsiveness, disruptive conduct, aggression, and inattention. Internalizing behaviors are broadly characterized as actions that direct problematic energy inward towards the self. It is characterized by anxiety, depression, emotional reactivity, and withdrawal. So some of our initial findings looked at the prevalence of maternal anxiety and depression among children with and without ASD in the SEED study. So looking at depression, about 27% of mothers of children with ASD in the SEED study reported that they experienced depression, 16% experienced anxiety, and when combining those two conditions, which are very closely related, about 33% of mothers of children with ASD experienced either of those conditions. Looking at the mothers of children without ASD, 18% experienced depression, 8% experienced anxiety, and about 22% experienced either of these conditions. So when we looked at factors that were associated with the presence of maternal anxiety and depression in the SEED study, the factors that we found to be associated with these conditions among the mothers with ASD was non-Hispanic white mothers had higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to mothers of other racial and ethnic groups. We found that mothers born in the US had a higher reported level of anxiety and depression compared to mothers born in other countries. Mothers that were native English speakers had higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to mothers that reported that they spoke a language other than English in the home. And mothers of children with ASD that had intellectual disability had higher reported levels of anxiety and depression compared to mothers of children children with ASD that did not have also intellectual disability. When looking at the factors associated with maternal anxiety and depression among the mothers that had children without ASD, the factors were fairly similar. Non-Hispanic white mothers reported higher levels than mothers of other racial and ethnic groups. Mothers that had lower levels of education or who were living in poverty, so had total household incomes that were beneath the federal poverty level, reported higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to mothers at higher levels of education and income. And then mothers born in the US compared to mothers born in other countries, and native English speakers compared to mothers that spoke a language other than English in the home reported higher levels of anxiety and depression. So when we looked at the relationship between maternal anxiety and depression and the presence of dysregulation in children, we found that maternal anxiety and depression was associated with a variety of types of dysregulation among both the mothers of children with ASD and the mothers of children without ASD. For the mothers of children with ASD, we found a relationship between maternal anxiety and depression and externalizing problems. So then we looked at subdomains of externalizing problems, and we found that there was a relationship with attention problems and aggression issues. Among the mothers of children with ASD, maternal anxiety and depression was associated with internalizing dysregulation. And when we looked at the subtypes, we found that there was a relationship between emotional reactivity and anxiety and depression. So, and then we also found a relationship with sleep issues. So higher levels of maternal anxiety and depression were associated with dysregulation among children, mothers of children with ASD. We found that among mothers of children without ASD, that maternal anxiety and depression were associated with externalizing dysregulation, internalizing dysregulation, and sleep issues, as well as all of the subdomains that we assessed. Now looking at paternal depression and anxiety. So in the SEED study, there was the levels of self-reported paternal anxiety and depression were much lower than maternal anxiety and depression. And there was not a significant difference between the fathers of children with ASD and the fathers of children without ASD. The prevalence of depression was under 10% for fathers with children with ASD and of fathers of children without ASD. For anxiety, it was below 6%. And the combination of the presence of depression or anxiety was beneath about 13%. And it was not significantly different between fathers of children with and without ASD. The factors associated with paternal depression and anxiety among the fathers of children with ASD was non-Hispanic white race compared to fathers of other racial and ethnic groups. Fathers born in the US had higher levels of depression and anxiety than fathers born in other countries. Native English speakers had higher levels of depression and anxiety than fathers that spoke other languages in the home. And fathers of children with ASD that also had intellectual disability had higher levels of depression and anxiety than fathers of children with ASD that did not have intellectual disability. For the fathers of children without ASD, paternal anxiety and depression were more common in non-Hispanic white fathers compared to fathers of other race and ethnic groups. Fathers born in the US, as well as fathers who are native English speakers compared to other countries of origin and other primary languages spoken in the home. When we looked at the relationship between paternal anxiety and depression and dysregulation in children, we found no associations between paternal anxiety and depression and dysregulation among the fathers of children with ASD. When we looked at among our population of children without ASD, we found more associations related to paternal anxiety and depression, including higher levels of externalizing behaviors, specifically aggression problems, higher levels of internalizing issues in the children, including emotional reactivity and sleep problems. So to wrap up, the next steps in this research are to determine if the relationships detected between maternal anxiety and depression, paternal anxiety and depression, and dysregulation in the children are independent of family income, parental education level, country of origin, and intellectual disability in the child. We will determine if pharmacologic treatment for depression and anxiety changes the nature of the relationship between the condition in the parents and dysregulation in the children. And we will determine how our findings could be used to inform early detection or screening for ASD, and how gender-specific norms for reporting of anxiety and depression between in parents and also receiving treatment for these conditions could influence our findings. So that's all I have. Are there any questions? Great, thank you for this opportunity to talk about this research.
Okay, so I will start my presentation. I'm very happy to be here today to speak with all of you. So I'm going to talk about sleep problems in children with in preschool age children and associations with sleep problems. So sleep issues are, this is probably an audience that doesn't need me to tell you some of these things, but they can be a significant issue for children with autism spectrum disorders. But you can see there's a pretty wide variability you know, in different studies. So we did look at this in the SEED study, and we really found similar rates of sleep problems in all three groups. And this was more of an epidemiologic study, so we had community resources, and so it was very helpful to know that these rates aren't that have been reported before aren't biased by people who are being seen at a research institution. So so this was, we found that kids with ASD, 70% had sleep problems, DD was 63%, and then the population was 50 when we used a cutoff on the Child Sleep Habits Questionnaire that's been recommended. We also felt like there was probably, the cutoff score is probably a little on the low side, and so we also looked at like the top quartile or the top 25% in the POP group, because we know that that might be, that's what's been reported. And we found that 50% of the kids with ASD had sleep issues using this higher cutoff, which would say that they have more severe sleep issues, and then 40% for the DD group and 27% for the POP group. Importantly, the Child Sleep Habits Questionnaire really isn't designed to look at severities, so to speak. It's really designed to say, are you having sleep problems or not? And so what we couldn't measure in this study was really the most severe sleep issues. So again, we all know that poor sleep can lead to difficult daytime behaviors. Attention and irritability are present in all children, well, in most children who have sleep issues. In children with autism, it also leads to more self-injury, repetitive behaviors, and aggression. And then another important aspect is that if you have a child with autism or even with developmental delay, your stress rate is different and higher if you also have sleep issues. And so this has huge implications for quality of life, not just for the child, but the whole family. We also know that there are a lot of physical impacts of poor sleep, memory consolidation, obesity, cortisol levels, and immune function. And so this really is not just behavioral health, but also physical health that's involved in poor sleep. So sleep is very complex. I know this is a busy slide, but it's very important to understand that when we're treating sleep issues in kids with autism or developmental delays, we really often have to use a multi-pronged approach because there are so many different things that could be contributing to the sleep issues, and often there's more than one. So there could be biological differences with melatonin production or glutamate, higher rates of things that can cause pain or discomfort, or obesity. And then, limited diets can often lead to low iron stores. We also have to look at whether there's obstructive sleep apnea or restless sleep. ADHD and anxiety can both contribute to sleep problems and are seen at least in about 40% of kids with ASD. And then obviously there's the behavioral pieces such as sensory sensitivities, difficulty with transitions. Sleep's the ultimate transition, right? And then issues with emotion regulation. So to better understand what causes sleep issues and also to help us with developing better treatment, we felt like it was important to understand what things are contributing the most to sleep issues. So we had almost 2,000 kids, about a third with autism, a third with DD, and a third with from the general population. And we actually, I know this analysis piece is kind of dry, but I want everyone to understand that we know that when we start comparing a bunch of different things, that we could get associations that don't really have to do with sleep, but have to do with how some of the variables are associated with each other. So we had more sleep issues in the group with ASD, but we also had, that group also had lower cognitive scores as a mean with a lot of variation. And so what we didn't want to do was say, oh, cognitive scores are associated with sleep problems. We didn't want to have this, kind of bias that because the group with more sleep problems had more cognitive issues, that must be related to sleep issues. So we adjusted for just sociodemographic variables because that's always an important thing to do when you're doing research. And we put all the kids together to give us more power because we're doing so many associations. And so in our second model, we adjusted for their sociodemographic also for their study group. So because it's important to take that into consideration. And then in our third model, we adjusted for all the covariates that we looked at, and we picked the ones that on a first pass seemed to be associated with sleep. So we looked at cognitive scores, we looked at anxiety and depression on the child behavior checklist. We looked at the social responsiveness scale to look at the degree of social difficulties. And then we looked at neurologic and genetic disorders that might have an impact on sleep. So kids with Down syndrome, Fragile X, Angelman, cerebral palsy, seizures, and then GI symptoms and body mass index, so obesity. We also, in this methods, we're looking at sleep as the outcome. So which of these things, if you have which of these things, or some of the, what things do you have that would predict having sleep problems? But we also know that sleep problems can cause behavioral issues. So we also looked at the opposite. So if you have sleep problems, are you more likely to have behavioral issues? And on the CBCL, for people who work with it, we looked at internalizing and externalizing symptoms as a group, but then we also looked at some of the empirically derived syndrome scales that we recognize from the literature can be associated with sleep problems. And we chose the empirically derived scale because sleep problems weren't included in the items in those, the items that would lead you to show that there's a higher score in that area. We looked at models to see, do sleep problems, are they associated with these developmental issues? So after we adjusted for all the co-occurring conditions, we found that if you had GI symptoms, you were 1.5 times more likely to have sleep problems. And if you had anxiety or depression, you were 4.5 times more likely to have sleep problems. Obviously, this is not a specific diagnosis of anxiety and depression because these were 2 to 5-year-olds. It's just elevated scores on the child behavior checklist. And then we also found that if you have sleep issues, you're more likely to have higher scores on internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And these are significant differences between the groups. We did see, before we adjusted for all the co-occurring conditions, there was an association between scores on the social relatedness questionnaire and sleep problems. But once we adjusted for interactions between the different conditions, we found that association went away. And there was also an association between cognitive scores and sleep that was significant, but it only contributed to about 1%. It was an increased risk of only 1%. And so we didn't feel like that was clinically relevant. And I think, let's see. When we use the higher cutoff score, we actually found that the anxiety depression scale contributed less to sleep problems. And I think the thought would be that if you have more severe sleep issues, anxiety may not be as big of a factor. So when we look at this data, we really have to understand that there are issues with directionality, right? So anxiety could cause sleep problems, but sleep problems can also cause anxiety. And there's a lot of work in sleep literature and children discussing this. You really need a longitudinal study to look at that, to know, does underlying anxiety lead to sleep problems, or do sleep problems lead to anxiety? And what I would say is it's probably both. It's really a chicken and egg thing. We also know that anxiety is associated with GI symptoms, that, this hyperarousal or that you see with anxiety can actually have an impact on gut motility in both directions, not just causing looser stools, but also causing constipation. And so, so then we thought, well, okay, this association, GI seems to be associated and anxiety seems to be associated. Well, is it just because they interact with each other? And we did a statistical analysis to look at that interaction, and we actually didn't find one. So it seems that they contribute independently. And I think that, again, if you're speculating, you'd say, well, maybe the hyperarousal, autonomic dysfunction that you see in kids with autism could cause both GI and sleep issues. So this was, this is all helpful because, one, when you're evaluating a sleep problem in a young child, and this is children just in the general population as well as children with autism and DD, you really should ask about gastrointestinal issues. Pain and discomfort could disrupt sleep. And then also about anxiety, depression symptoms as well. And then for next steps, we want to look at, because we have genetic samples for these kiddos, we want to look at whether there are higher numbers of genes associated with sleep problems in the group with ASD and DD. Also, are there some genes that independently seem to be associated with sleep issues that we may not think about? We probably will have some difficulty with having enough samples to really do a lot of gene finding, but certainly the sleep associated genes, it would be helpful to know, is there an issue with melatonin? Well, this might be a child who's more likely to respond to melatonin as a treatment. And really, it's a physical attribute that's supposed to be there that isn't. And so melatonin could be considered, you're replacing something that's not there. And there is some data in very small studies to support that. So, the idea is how can we improve our therapeutic targets in kids with sleep? And so that would be our next steps. Thank you to all the families that participated, all the collaborators, obviously funding from the CDC and then NIH for the CTSA, and the Carbon Valley Half Marathon supported the analysis. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or if we should just move on to Nuri.
Not seeing any questions right now, but we will have time at the end for questions. So think about putting them in the chat with respect to any of the papers. And with that, Nuri, you're on.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, but you're not in presentation mode. There. Good.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for attending this morning and for taking your time of your day to spend this morning with us, and everybody, English and Spanish speaking participant. Thank you for being here with us today. We're excited to share these findings. At this point, everybody knows about what the SEED study, our cohort and our data and how it was collected. What I would like to do today then is present about language and social regression in children with autism spectrum disorder for the first cohort of the SEED study. So I would like to thank all the collaborators as well as authors that have helped and contributed to the analysis and also interpretation of these findings. The first thing that I would like to do then is I would like to talk about what regression is and how we define it. So when we talk about regression, we usually talk about the loss of a previously acquired skill. And that skill can be language abilities, like word or social responsiveness, like respond to social smiles, or praise skills. What we know from previous research is that children with ASD tend to experience regression more so than other children with other disabilities. We also know that regression in children with ASD usually occur parents usually report this type of regression before 24 months. Some studies report that at 18 months, usually children tend to lose skills, especially language skills. Most children with ASD, previous research report that most children with ASD tend to lose language. So it is estimated that around 20 to 40% of children with ASD have some sort of regression. And those statistics or those proportions are a little bit different because it depends on the study, the number of children, and how the method that I use to assess regression. So for this study, what we wanted to do, we wanted to assess the proportion of children that parents report having some sort of regression in language or social skills. And we use language and social because those two domains are really are often associated with clinical characteristics or symptoms of the autism spectrum disorder. The other aim of this study was to assess developmental levels, adaptive skills or activity of daily living, and behavioral emotional problems. In other words, we wanted to see whether children with a history of regression were presenting different skills compared to children without a history of regression. To do that, we included SEED1 data, and we included 671 children. And within those children, we had 121 girls. This sample for this analysis, these children participated in the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule data, and parents completed the Autism Diagnostic Interview, or ADR. Those two measures combined are usually used when we want to characterize and we wanted to understand better the autism symptoms in this population. So the way we thought about regression, the way we tried to define regression for this study was that we used questions in the ADR. We asked parents or caregivers to tell us whether the children had a history of regression in their language or social skills. And if the parent said yes, or probably a history of regression, then we created 4 different groups: language regression only, social regression only, or language and social regression. For instance, for language regressions, parents had to report that a child was using more than 5 words daily and that they used those words for about 3 months before losing them. In terms of the differences, we used the Mullen Scale of Early Learning to assess children's developmental levels in terms of receptive language, expressive language, fine motor skills, and visual receptive skills. To assess activity of daily living, we use the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, which is a parent report, and the child behavior checklist that previous presentation have reported try to assess internalizing and externalizing problems. Again, the Vineland and the CBCLs are parent report. The Mullen Scale of Early Learning is an assessment done in person with the child by a trained clinician. So these are some of the findings. So we found that if you look on the left, the bigger bar, we found that 70% of parents reported that they did not report a history of regression in their children. We found that close to 9% of parents reported that children had a language regression, around 8% social regression, and about 8% language plus social regression, based on the questions on the ADR. In terms of developmental levels using the Mullen, we found that children with a history of regression compared to children without a history of regression show lowered visual reception skills in the Mullen. Children with language regression and social regression, they also show lower fine motor skills in the Mullen. And with regard to language, children with language regression and a combined social and language regression show lowered receptive language and expressive language skills in the Mullen. With respect to adaptive skills or activity of daily living, we found that, as many of you know, the Vineland assesses communication, social skills, daily living skills, and motor skills. But when compared children with a history of regression, children without a history of regression, we found that communication skill was the only difference between those two groups. Children with language regression and language plus social regression show lower communication skills as assessed by parent report. Finally, in the CBCL and behavioral and emotional problems, we did not find externalizing problems were different between the two groups, but we did find that children with language regression and social regression tended to show increased internalizing problems compared to children without a history of regression. Okay, so what we make of these findings. So we found that around 26% of children with ASD, parents are reporting some sort of regression. It could be language, social, or combined of those two. We also know that children with history of regression show lower developmental levels during the preschool years. And that's a key finding during the preschool years, because as you might remember, the SID study have included children ages 2 to 5 years of age. And they also show lowered adaptive communication skill and increased internalizing problem. Those are the findings for this analysis. So we know previous research has reported that children with seizures, minimal language skills, aggression, or self-injurious behaviors tend to have poor outcomes. What we don't know whether long-term children with a history of regression would also have poor outcome. So it was really nice and a kind of a good news to talk about this study, this new paper that was published in the last couple of months, in which they found that children with a history of regression develop fresh speech at the same time. They also found, they followed the kid at 3, 6, and 10 years of age. And when they did assessment at 10 years of age, they found no difference in communication skills as reported on the Vineland. So in this study, they only included language regression, and they only included a measure of language as reported by parents. So it is possible that we have some evidence that having a language regression does not have negative long-term outcome, but we don't know whether other areas would not be affected as we do not assess children beyond age of 5. So we don't know if parents with children with a regression, they have earlier concern. We don't know if they have an early diagnosis of referrals, or if early intervention service are acquired earlier as well. We also don't know the response treatment with children with or without a history of regression. Finally, I don't have an answer to this, but it would be also important that in future to understand whether we have any underlying mechanism that also it's associated with regression, with autism, and also internalizing problems. Okay, and that's all I have, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Nuri, and thanks to everyone. We do certainly have some time for questions and discussions, so please enter them into the chat. And I see we have a question from Brian. How are we focusing on protective factors in research? Example, Dr. Crum, did you state a reason why we would focus on deficiencies versus strengths focused during your report out? Tessa, who's that?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great comment, and I think that that would be a really interesting direction to explore more. Some of the instruments that we've collected and metrics that we could think about as measures of resiliency. As a perinatal epidemiologist, I will admit I've always, and a mother, I've always been a little sensitive about mom blaming research. So I have some slight conflicts with those ideas. But the reason that I am, I guess, so excited about this analysis is because I think depression and anxiety in parents, in people in general, is very widespread. And I think it's, it's the relationship between the anxiety and depression that you have as a parent and how that impacts your children, is not necessarily clear. We know there's a relationship. We know that anxious and depressed parents tend to have children that are anxious and depressed, or may have, externalizing issues. So I think it's really exciting to better understand why is there this connection, and are there different, what I would say is protective factors that can potentially break that cycle. But I think it's a great comment, because sometimes we don't focus enough in research in general on the relationship between different aspects of the parents, focused on measures of resilience or thriving in the children. So I think that's something we should talk about more as a research team.
Thank you.
Brian, go ahead. Happy to hear from you, but you're muted.
Hi, folks. Brian B. I am an autistic artist, and I have had the privilege of joining this SEED study, but very late in the game. They've been going for decades, and I've been on for about 1 year. Here's what I know about attention. You find more of what you're looking for. If you're not familiar with that, try playing with it with yourself. Look at your kitchen. Is it dirty or is it clean? Go looking for the dirty parts, you'll find it. Go looking for the clean parts, you'll find it. And therefore, it is my opinion and it is my experience that in research, we find more of what we're looking for. So I would like to see SEED, as well as many other scientific communities, clinicians, to look for what is strong with you, as well as what is wrong with you. To oversimplify it, but it rhymes, so I like that. What's strong with you, as well as what's wrong with you. They're both powerful stories. And just simply looking for it and observing and measuring it can make more of it happen. Thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Brian. And Selena has said, Dr. Crum, could some outcomes of your research drive more openness about mental health for men and women during pregnancy and after in the US? Wow. Big
Yeah, I would hope so. It's a time when everything changes, and I think that having a strong relationship with healthcare providers both going into pregnancy and in that period of time after, which is, life just gets turned upside down, is so important for supporting families and supporting people on our journeys as we go from being non-parents to being parents. So yes, I certainly hope that's the case.
Thank you. And I'd open the invitation to presenters to bring on questions as well. Anne, I wonder, I sent you a note. What do we know about effective interventions around sleep?
There's a good bit of data that melatonin can be helpful for getting to sleep in children with autism and DD. We know much less about that in kids who have typical development. We also have and that goes along with a little bit of data that there are some differences in melatonin production, not only how much you produce, but when you produce it in kids with autism. We know that sleep hygiene strategies can be extremely helpful, but you really have to tailor it to the child and the family, because just kind of trying to take traditional, just turn off the iPad. Well, that is ideal. How are we going to do that in a child who really, really likes their iPad? And so can we gradually switch the iPad to, dimmer light and more orange red light? And then can we maybe switch from an exciting game to a more calming video? And then can we switch from turn the iPad around and just listen to the video? I mean, there's all kinds of things that you really have to be creative. And you have to think outside the box when you're thinking about sleep hygiene issues. There is a lot of anecdotal data that clonidine can be helpful for getting to sleep, but no good research on that. We know that about 8% of kids with autism have low iron stores, and iron stores have been associated with restless leg syndrome. And so if there's a child who's restless, there was one study that showed improvement, in restlessness with treating with iron, but it was open label and there weren't any, objective measures of sleep. We tried to do a study to look more carefully at that, but we weren't able to recruit enough subjects. You have to make sure there isn't an underlying discomfort. You have to, are they constipated? Do they have reflux? Because every 90 minutes you cycle through light sleep. And so if there's something causing discomfort, it's going to wake you up. So we do know that parent education is helpful. There's evidence for that. And we do know that, and by parent education, it's like understanding what's going to help you sleep. Like blue light, white light is going to suppress melatonin much more than red light, or knowing that every 90 minutes you cycle through light sleep. And so educating parents on that can help them come up with strategies to problem solve. So there's good evidence on sleep hygiene work. There's good evidence on melatonin, not much evidence on anything else. So I'd have gone on a little too long.
Not at all, thank you. Is Autism Treatment Network still a good, or Autism Speaks, a good resource for those materials?
Yeah, there's a good handout or a toolkit for sleep issues. Terry Catt and Beth Mallow also wrote a book for parents on sleep.
Great, thank you. And we'll see about getting links to those in the follow-up. Okay. Carolyn, early on, you commented on differences in findings regarding anxiety and depression and self-injurious behaviors. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. One of our colleagues, Dr. Soke, did look at the relationship between maternal depression and anxiety and self-injurious behaviors. He looked at that in the SEED study that was published a couple of years ago. There was some evidence to suggest greater self-injurious behaviors among children of mothers who reported anxiety or depression during pregnancy. However, when other differences between the groups were taken into account, that relationship was no longer apparent. For example, obstetric complications and some other characteristics of the children, like sleep problems and gastrointestinal problems that were related to self-injurious behavior. And I did put the link to that paper, as well as another paper, which unfortunately doesn't look at maternal depression, anxiety, but they're both about self-injurious behavior if you're interested.
Thank you. Okay. Tessa, did you want to comment any more around the questions about resilience?
I think the question is about increased awareness of depression and anxiety around the pregnancy period. And I think I already did address that.
I could jump in,
Sure.
Dr. Rosenberg, on these last couple of questions. There's one about any follow-up studies available. So I'm not sure if that person is referring to, so I did describe the follow-up studies we're about to launch, where we're going to recontact families and collect data. We don't have follow-up studies yet, but we are getting ready to launch that. That was the study that I described. Thank you for mentioning you were a participant. We would love to see you back in our follow-up studies so we can learn more there. And I also wanted to mention, I believe there has been one study done about the association between fertility treatment and autism. And if you will just give me a minute, I will, or if Christina has it, to give you the link.
Yeah, I'm looking for it right now. This is Laura Sheaves, right?
Yeah, Laura's paper. Yeah, exactly. So I don't have the link handy, but we can put that in there and yeah. Well, thank you. That would be great to have you participate. Yes. So we'll be collecting, we'll be recontacting all the participants and asking if they'd be willing to complete a survey about where their child is now. And some of those participants will also be inviting back. You must have been SEED 2. So yes, we'll be inviting back if for some additional testing if the parent is interested in that.
Great. I think our time frame for that happening is probably
Next year.
late this year or early next year. Is that correct, Christina? Or might those?
We will hopefully start enrolling in late fall, early winter of this year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for our presenters and our participants. We really appreciate having this opportunity to communicate with you about SEED and now the SEED follow-up studies. You'll, as was indicated in the beginning, you'll receive a link to go to an evaluation. We would really appreciate you following that link and completing it. And also this webinar will be archived on the JFK website. So again, thanks so much for your participation. I see Christina's put that link in. And I don't know, I think we can preserve the chat as well in terms of the archive, if you don't get a chance to put things down.
Yeah, and I actually just put the attachment, but I will get the link to Christine so that she can put it in the archive.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good to see everyone today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.